I never expected my backyard to become a battleground, but that's exactly what happened last Saturday. For the past 5 years, I've hosted what our neighborhood calls the Heroes Cookout, an annual BBQ fundraiser for wounded veterans that started small but has grown into something I'm genuinely proud of. It all began when my brother Mike returned from his third deployment with a Purple Heart and invisible scars that ran deeper than any physical wound. The PTSD made him withdraw from nearly everyone, and watching his struggle ignited something in me. If I couldn't heal him, maybe I could help others who wore the same haunted expression he did. That first year, it was just a few folding tables, a borrowed grill, and about 20 people, mostly family. We raised $340 and donated it to the VA hospital's recreational therapy program. Nothing groundbreaking, but it was a start. This year was different. American flags lined my fence, red, white, and blue bunting draped across tables laden with donated food. Local businesses had stepped up. Henderson's butcher shop provided enough premium cuts to feed a small army, which was fitting since that's exactly who we were expecting. 3 large banners thanked service members for their sacrifice, and a donation station was decorated with photos of veterans who'd benefited from previous year's contributions. The whole neighborhood had rallied around the cause. Mrs. Abernathy, from 2 doors down, had baked 30 apple pies. The Garcia family brought their professional sound equipment. Even old Mr. Peterson, who complained about everything from children laughing too loudly to birds chirping at dawn, had quietly slipped me a check for $500. By 9 that morning, volunteers were already arranging chairs, setting up the sound system, and preparing for the noon kickoff. Mike was there too, his 5th year attending, each one easier than the last, as the event helped him reconnect with fellow service members who understood what words could never express. Everything was going perfectly until our new neighbor decided to take matters into her own hands. I spotted her watching from her second-story window, phone already pressed to her ear, completely unaware that her impending complaint was about to backfire in the most spectacular way possible. The morning of the event always gives me butterflies. 5 years in, and I still wake up at 5 a.m., double-checking my lists and mentally walking through every detail. By 7 a.m., the first volunteers arrived. The Rodriguez brothers, both former Marines, showed up with their truck loaded with extra coolers and ice. Sarah Jenkins from the local bakery followed shortly after with dozens of patriotic-themed cupcakes, each topped with tiny, edible flags. "Looks like this year's going to be the biggest yet, Dan," Sarah said, setting down the last tray. My cousin's driving in from Hartford with his unit buddies. They saw last year's event on Facebook. That was the thing about the Heroes Cookout. It had taken on a life of its own. What started as a small gesture for Mike had become a regional event for veterans throughout the state. Last year, we'd raised nearly $12,000, and this year, we were hoping to break $15,000. Among our special guests would be Sergeant James Wilson, a Medal of Honor recipient who'd saved his entire unit during an ambush outside Kandahar. He'd contacted me personally after seeing our fundraising page, offering to help however he could. I'd arranged for him to say a few words, nothing formal, just a moment to connect everyone to the cause we were supporting. Channel 8 News had also scheduled a crew to cover the event. Not prime time or anything, just a human interest piece for the evening broadcast, but the exposure would help spread the word for next year. Their van was due to arrive around 1 p.m. As I hammered in the last stake for the donation tent, I caught sight of her again. Karen Winters, who'd moved into the blue Colonial across the street just 3 months ago. In those 3 months, she'd already filed complaints about the Taylor Kids lemonade stand, called animal control on Mr. Ferris's perfectly well-behaved golden retriever, and left a typed notice on my door about my grass being a 1/4 inch too tall. Today she stood at her living room window, arms crossed, scowling at the activity in my yard. When she caught me looking, she didn't wave or smile, just pulled out her phone and began typing furiously. "That's the neighbor you mentioned?" Mike asked, following my gaze as he set down a stack of chairs. "Yeah," I sighed. "I was hoping she'd just stay inside today. Maybe I should go talk to her, explain what we're doing." Mike shook his head. "Some battles aren't worth fighting, Dan. Focus on what matters today. I nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't going to let us enjoy a peaceful event. Still, with veterans and their families already starting to arrive, I pushed the thought aside. Today wasn't about neighborhood drama, it was about something much bigger than that. By noon, my backyard and the adjacent community green space we'd received permission to use were transformed. The smell of grilling burgers and hot dogs filled the air as families spread out picnic blankets and veterans greeted each other with the unique camaraderie that only comes from shared service. "Danny boy," a booming voice called out as Colonel Richards, retired after 30 years in the Army, pulled me into a bear hug. "You've outdone yourself this year." He was right. We had over 200 people already, with more arriving every few minutes. Kids ran around with red, white, and blue streamers, and someone had started playing a playlist of patriotic country songs through the sound system. Mike was in his element, introducing newer veterans to the support groups that had helped him. I watched him actually laugh, as he shared stories with a young Marine who'd returned just 6 months ago. These moments were why I did this every year. "Excuse me." The voice behind me was tight, controlled, and unmistakably irritated. I turned to find Karen standing there, arms folded across her chest, designer sunglasses perched on her nose despite the cloudy day. "I need to speak with you about this gathering." "Karen, hello," I said, trying to sound welcoming. "We're hosting our annual Veterans Fundraiser. Would you like to join us? There's plenty of food." "That's not why I'm here," she said, looking around with obvious disapproval. "This is excessive. The noise, the cars parked all down the street. I counted at least 15 parking violations. And do you even have a permit for this?" I kept my smile fixed in place. "Actually, yes, we have all the necessary permits, including a special event noise variance until 7 p.m. As for parking, we've coordinated with the police department, and they're aware that today's a special circumstance." Karen's mouth tightened into a thin line. "Well, I work from home, and this is disrupting my important Zoom calls. Not everyone has the luxury of taking Saturday off, you know." Before I could respond, Mike appeared at my side. "Ma'am, I'm Dan's brother, Mike. We're raising money for veterans like myself who came home with PTSD and other injuries. Would you like to make a donation?" His directness was something I'd always admired, especially knowing how much it cost him to speak to strangers these days. Karen looked from Mike to me, then at the gathering crowd. For a moment, I thought she might soften. Instead, she said, "I shouldn't have to donate to be entitled to peace and quiet in my own home. This should have been held in a park, not a residential neighborhood." "We understand your concern," I began, but she was already turning away. "Just keep it down," she snapped over her shoulder, "or I'll be forced to call someone who will." Mike shook his head as we watched her march back to her house. "Cheerful lady," I sighed. "Forget about her. We've got Sergeant Wilson arriving any minute, and the donation table needs more volunteer forms." The event continued, gathering momentum as the afternoon progressed. A group of Vietnam veterans had formed a circle of lawn chairs, sharing stories that alternated between making them roar with laughter and wipe away tears. The younger veterans were clustered around the basketball hoop I'd set up, a friendly game in progress that had drawn a small crowd of cheering kids. The donation table was busy nonstop, with a steady stream of people dropping off checks and cash. Mrs. Abernathy had already counted over $8,000, and we weren't even halfway through the day. I'd almost forgotten about Karen until I glanced up and saw her silhouette in her upstairs window, phone pressed to her ear, gesturing animatedly as she looked down at our gathering. A feeling of unease settled in my stomach, but I pushed it aside. No one person was going to ruin this day. It was just after 3 p.m. when I noticed a hush falling over one section of the gathering. The music played on, but heads were turning, conversations pausing. Following their gaze, my heart sank. A police cruiser had pulled up in front of my house, lights off but unmistakably official. "Heads up," Colonel Richards muttered, appearing at my side. "Looks like your neighbor made good on her threat." Two officers stepped out of the vehicle, Officer Ramirez, who I recognized from community meetings, and a younger officer I didn't know. They walked purposefully toward the yard, their expressions professional but not hostile. From the corner of my eye, I could see Karen standing at the edge of her driveway, arms crossed in apparent satisfaction. Several of the veterans had noticed her too, and the atmosphere shifted subtly. "Afternoon, officers," I said, meeting them at the edge of my property. "What can I help you with?" Officer Ramirez nodded politely. "Mr. Carter, we received a noise complaint and a report about an unauthorized gathering potentially violating several town ordinances." The younger officer added, "We've also had complaints about parking issues blocking access to driveways." I took a deep breath. "I have all our permits right here," I said, retrieving the folder I'd prepared specifically for this possibility. "We have a special event permit, noise variance until 7 p.m., and permission from the HOA to use the community green space. As for parking, we've been monitoring it closely to ensure no driveways are blocked." As I handed over the documentation, Sergeant Wilson approached. With his combat medals visible on his veteran's cap and his ramrod-straight posture, there was no mistaking his military background. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone used to command. "Just a routine check, sir," Officer Ramirez said, but I noticed his demeanor change slightly, a straightening of his posture, and instinctive respect. "I'm Sergeant James Wilson," he said, extending his hand. "Medal of Honor, Afghanistan. This event is raising funds for veteran support services, critical work, especially for those of us who came back with the kinds of wounds you can't see." The younger officer's eyes widened slightly in recognition. "My father served in Iraq," he said. "2 tours with the 101st Airborne." "A fine division," Wilson nodded. "He'd be welcome here today." By now, a small crowd of veterans had gathered nearby, not confrontational but present. Among them was Mike, standing taller than I'd seen him in years, surrounded by men and women who shared his experiences. Officer Ramirez looked through the permits, then at the gathering, and finally over to Karen, who was now walking toward us with determination. "Well, your permits are in order, Mr. Carter," he said, handing back the folder. "And I don't see any immediate parking violations." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "My cousin lost both legs in Fallujah. He benefited from programs like the ones you're supporting. Thank you for doing this." Karen reached our group just as Officer Ramirez was shaking my hand. "Excuse me," she interjected, "but are you actually going to let this continue? The noise is unbearable, and these people are trespassing on community property." The younger officer turned to her. "Ma'am, they have all the necessary permits, including HOA approval for use of the community space." "That's impossible," Karen insisted. "I'm on the HOA board, and I never approved this." "You joined the board last month, Karen," I pointed out as gently as I could. "These approvals were granted 2 months ago, unanimously." "Well, they should be rescinded," she said, her voice rising. "This is a residential area, not a fairground." "Ma'am," Sergeant Wilson stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying. "My name is James Wilson. 5 years ago, I was in Afghanistan when our unit was ambushed. 8 of my brothers didn't come home. The ones who did, like myself, came back changed. Some of us lost limbs, all of us lost friends. Many of us struggle every day with what we experienced." Karen blinked, momentarily thrown off her rhythm, but quickly recovered. "That's very unfortunate, but it doesn't give you the right to disrupt an entire neighborhood." A murmur ran through the gathering crowd. I could feel the tension rising and was about to intervene when another veteran stepped forward. This was Melissa Tran, who'd served as a combat medic and now worked as a nurse at the VA hospital. "The funds raised here today," she said quietly, "helped pay for my therapy dog, Santos." She gestured to the German Shepherd sitting alertly at her side. "Before Santos, I couldn't go to a grocery store without having a panic attack. I couldn't sleep without nightmares. This event, this community, gave me back some semblance of normal life." Karen looked increasingly uncomfortable as more veterans began to share their stories. An older man described how programs funded by last year's event had helped him finally get proper care for injuries sustained in Vietnam decades ago. A young woman explained how a support group had prevented her from taking her own life after returning from deployment. The Channel 8 news van had arrived during this exchange, and I noticed their camera operator had begun filming from a respectful distance. This wasn't the coverage I had expected, but there was a raw truth unfolding that couldn't be scripted. Karen's expression shifted from indignation to uncertainty as she looked around at the faces surrounding her. The police officers had stepped back, clearly seeing no reason to intervene. In the momentary silence, the sound system switched to a somber rendition of "God Bless America," and several veterans instinctively stood straighter. "I don't understand why this has to be here," Karen said, but some of the fight had gone out of her voice. "There are proper venues for events like this." Colonel Richards, who had been silently observing, finally spoke. "Young lady, this is exactly the proper venue. Community, neighbors, family. That's what many of us fought to protect. That's what many of us lost when we came home broken in ways you can't see." Karen's gaze dropped to the ground. The crowd had grown larger, with neighbors coming out of their homes, drawn by the confrontation, but staying for the moment of raw emotion unfolding before them. "You have no idea what it's like," Karen suddenly said, her voice catching. "You all stand there judging me, but you have no idea." Something in her tone made everyone go still. The cameraman from Channel 8 took a step closer. "My brother David was killed in Mosul in 2007, Karen said, her voice barely above a whisper. The crowd went completely silent. He was 22 years old. Today would have been his birthday. The revelation hung in the air. I felt as if the ground had shifted beneath my feet. The entire confrontation suddenly recast in a different light. Karen continued, her composure cracking. "I moved here to get away from my hometown where everyone knew David, where everyone looked at me with pity every year on his birthday. And then I wake up today to find all of this." She gestured at the flags, the banners, the gathering of veterans. It was like I couldn't escape it, like some cosmic joke. So yes, I called the police. I'm sorry. The silence that followed was profound. Then Sergeant Wilson stepped forward and did something unexpected. He saluted Karen. "Your brother was our brother too," he said simply. Mike moved next, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the challenge coin he always carried, a memento from his unit. He pressed it into Karen's hand. "We remember them," he said. "Every day, we remember." One by one, the veterans stepped forward. Some offered quiet words, others simply nodded in understanding. A Vietnam veteran placed his hand on Karen's shoulder, no words necessary between two people who understood loss. Mrs. Abernathy appeared with a plate of food and gently led Karen to an empty chair at one of the tables. The news crew, sensing the delicate nature of the moment, had lowered their camera. Officer Ramirez quietly told me they'd be leaving, no issues to address. As they walked back to their cruiser, I noticed the younger officer discreetly wipe his eyes. The event continued, but with a subtle shift in energy. Karen remained, initially sitting quietly, then gradually beginning to speak with those around her. I overheard her sharing stories about David. His laugh, his terrible singing voice, his dreams of becoming a history teacher after his service. By sunset, Karen was helping serve food, her earlier hostility replaced by a fragile connection to the community she'd tried to reject. When Sergeant Wilson gave his speech, she stood in respectful silence, tears streaming unchecked down her face. As the event wound down, the donation total was announced, $18,753, well above our goal. When Karen heard this, she walked to the donation table, wrote a check, and silently placed it in the collection box. I didn't see the amount, but Mrs. Abernathy's widened eyes told me it was substantial. "I'd like to help next year," Karen said quietly when she found me later, as volunteers were starting to clean up. David would have loved this. He always said the hardest part of service was coming home and feeling alone. "We'd welcome the help," I told her honestly, "and I'm sorry about today, about not understanding." She shook her head. "How could you have known? I never gave anyone the chance to know me." She looked around at the remnants of the gathering. "But I'd like to change that." As the last of the decorations came down and the final veterans said their goodbyes, I found myself standing with Mike and Karen in my increasingly quiet backyard. The three of us worked in companionable silence, folding chairs and taking down the American flags that had lined the fence. "You know," Mike said as he carefully folded a flag with practiced precision, "when I first came home, I couldn't stand events like this. The noise, the people, the expectations. Dan started this whole thing partly because of me, but I couldn't even attend that first year." Karen nodded, understanding in her eyes. David's unit held a memorial. I couldn't bring myself to go. My parents went, but I just couldn't. Grief and trauma have their own timelines, Mike said. No one can rush either. As we finished cleaning up, Karen helped Mike load the last of the supplies into his truck. Same time next year? She asked, a tentative smile forming. Same time next year, I confirmed. But maybe we can have coffee before then. Get to know each other as neighbors should. The Channel 8 news segment aired that evening. Instead of the standard human interest piece they'd planned, they ran a 6-minute story about unexpected connections and the invisible bonds of loss and service that can unite even apparent adversaries. They didn't sensationalize the confrontation, but focused instead on the reconciliation, on the community that had formed around shared understanding. Within days, the station's social media post of the story had been shared thousands of times. Donations continued to pour in from people touched by what they'd seen. Karen's vulnerability and the veterans' compassion resonated with viewers in a way that a simple fundraiser story never could have. A week later, I found a potted plant on my porch with a simple note. Thank you for helping me remember David the right way. Karen. Sometimes the battles we think we're fighting aren't the real ones at all. Sometimes behind anger lies pain, behind confrontation lies a desperate need for connection. And sometimes the most powerful act of service is simply making space for someone else's truth alongside your own. As for next year's Heroes Cookout, planning has already begun. Karen is heading the outreach committee, using her organizational skills to contact veteran groups throughout the state. We're expecting an even bigger turnout, though I've made sure to file for all the proper permits well in advance. Some battles aren't worth fighting, as Mike said, but building bridges, that's always worth the effort.